James Mitchell opened the HOA fine and froze. They said he was blasting music in a red Mustang outside Unit 14B. One problem. He hadn't owned a car in 3 years, ever since he sold it to afford his wife's funeral. The photo attached to the ticket wasn't even his building. But when he showed up at the next board meeting with proof, they laughed him out of the room. What happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the aging stucco walls of the Westridge Villas complex. James Mitchell walked with the heavy gait of a man who carried more than tools and time on his back. His uniform shirt clung to his shoulders, still damp from sweat and the humid breath of forklifts. He adjusted the strap on his lunch pail, stopped at his mailbox like he did every evening, and pulled out the usual stack. Coupons, bills, something glossy from the local church. And then he saw it. A plain white envelope with the HOA's seal stamped cold and official across the flap. He opened it there, standing on the brittle concrete with the low whine of cicadas in his ears. The fine slipped out like a slap. $150. Violation, playing loud music in vehicle. Date and time. Unit listed, 14B. Attached, a grainy photo of a red Ford Mustang, parked with its door ajar, the blur of motion suggesting someone inside, though the photo was too poor to prove much of anything. Still, it wasn't his car. It wasn't even his building. James hadn't driven in over 3 years. The Mustang might have well been a UFO. He hadn't sat behind a wheel since the winter he buried his wife and sold the Toyota Camry they'd shared for 15 years. The heater had gone out, the transmission was dying, and the bills had piled up like snowdrifts. Selling the car had been surrender and survival. Since then, James had walked 5 miles to the warehouse and 5 miles home. Every single day. In boots worn at the heel and soles patched with glue, past strip malls and broken sidewalks, in Texas heat and January cold. His jaw tensed as he read the citation again. A flush crawled up his neck. Not embarrassment. Something harder. Something heavier. He looked up at the building, Unit 14B in clear view from where he stood. The red Mustang was parked there now, shiny and smug in the glow of dusk. Probably the new kids. Loud music? Sure. But that wasn't James. And yet here he was, accused, charged, fined. He folded the letter once, slowly, with the precision of a man used to being dismissed but not used to being lied about. "They don't even know who I am," he muttered. Not yet, but they would. James sat at the kitchen table with the same focus he brought to inventory sheets and forklift inspections. The form was simple: 2 pages, 4 check boxes, 1 optional field for a statement. He filled it out in blocky, no-nonsense handwriting, the kind his foreman once joked looked like a blueprint in Sharpie. To it, he stapled 3 months of pay stubs and a signed letter from HR confirming he walked to work. No car, no license renewal, no registered vehicle in his name. He even included a photo of his apartment's empty parking spot, Space 12C, labeled in chipped yellow paint and framed by cracked asphalt. A silent witness to his routine. When he dropped the packet into the HOA drop box that evening, it felt like dropping an anchor into shallow water. Useless, but necessary. A week passed. No reply. Then, on Thursday morning, the envelope came. Same crisp white. Same emblem like a brand pressed into skin. Inside, a single sheet, stark and impersonal. Dispute denied. Infraction stands. Payment due within 15 days. The stamp in bold red ink stared at him like an accusation. No explanation, no acknowledgement, just judgment. James called the number listed in the footer. 3 rings, then a chirpy voice. "Westridge Villas Homeowners Association, how can I help you?" He explained everything. Again, slowly, carefully, as if clarity would fix what had already been decided behind a desk he'd never seen. The receptionist, her name was Tara, or maybe Taryn, sounded barely old enough to vote. She spoke in half-sighs and scripted disclaimers. "Sir, unless you filed a vehicle exemption form, the fine is valid." "But I don't have a vehicle," James repeated, voice tight. "That's not the point," she said, as if explaining the weather to a stubborn child. "We're not saying you played the music. We're saying there was no record of your non-ownership. Without that, you're technically out of compliance." He sat in stunned silence, one hand gripping the corner of the table, knuckles white. This wasn't about proof. He'd given proof. This wasn't about the music or the car or the grainy photo of someone else's Mustang. It was about the rules. Not fairness. Not reality. Rules written in fine print, interpreted at will, and enforced without shame. The HOA didn't want facts. They wanted obedience. And in that moment, James saw it for what it was. Not a misunderstanding, but a warning. Toe the line, or get fined for standing still. The second envelope came on a Monday, fat with indifference. It slid from James's mailbox like a paper cut waiting to happen, white, glossy, and as cold as every phone call he'd made. The wording was different this time, more severe. "Second offense, failure to correct noise violation." The language made it sound like he'd doubled down, like he'd turned up the volume, thrown open the doors of some imaginary car, and dared the HOA to stop him. There was no mention of the dispute. No acknowledgement that he'd never owned the Mustang, just a new amount due, $250, layered atop the original $150. He rubbed a thumb along the crease of the letter, the skin raw from work and weather, and dropped it on the kitchen counter like it might stain the wood. By the end of the week, a third citation arrived. This time, persistent non-compliance, $125 penalty. Total, $525. He stood in the center of his living room, a narrow space where the light came in, filtered through the blinds like judgment. The faded recliner looked like it might collapse if he sat in it angry. His fists clenched at his sides, jaw tight, breath sharp and shallow. He wasn't just angry. He was insulted. 3 years without a vehicle. 3 years of walking 5 miles each way to a warehouse where nobody noticed if he was limping, where the floors vibrated with machinery and heat. His feet had carried him through rainstorms and heat waves, his lunchbox swinging like a metronome of perseverance. He'd done everything right. Always had. Paid on time. Kept his grass short. Kept to himself. But now the system said he was a repeat offender. He started asking around. The Mustang, it turned out, belonged to the kid in Unit 14B. Jason, maybe 19, wore earbuds around his neck like jewelry and revved the engine just for fun. Half the neighborhood heard him blast music at midnight. But his dad coached Little League with someone on the HOA board. His mom did book club with 2 others. No one said it outright. They didn't have to. Jason was safe. James was alone. He looked down at the stack of citations, at the clean, mechanical language that erased his sweat, his miles, his grief. And something in him, something long folded, began to rise. Not in protest, not yet, but in awareness. They weren't just fining him, they were daring him to fight. The fluorescent lights in the HOA's multi-purpose room buzzed faintly, casting a pale green sheen across the linoleum floors. The folding chairs were arranged in strict rows, and the folding tables at the front held neat stacks of untouched agendas. Props in a play James Mitchell no longer believed in. He stood before the board, clutching a battered manila folder like it was armor. Inside, bus passes with his name printed in block letters, a series of time-stamped security cam stills showing him walking past the leasing office at 6:04 a.m. day after day. A notarized letter from his supervisor confirmed it. James hadn't driven a car in over 3 years. He presented each document slowly, deliberately, placing them on the table with a calm that had taken everything in him to maintain. He didn't shout, he didn't beg. He simply laid out the truth. Linda Cartwright, the HOA chairwoman, didn't even lean forward. She wore a navy blue blazer that looked like it cost more than James's monthly grocery bill, and a silver pin in the shape of an eagle that gleamed under the flickering lights. Her hands were folded neatly in front of her, French manicure unchipped, face unreadable. "We can't investigate every little discrepancy," she said, flipping through the bus passes like they were junk mail. "This is a community. We expect compliance." James took a breath, lips pressed tight. "I walk. Rain, snow. I've walked every day." "Then walk away from the fines," she interrupted, her tone so smug it sucked the air from the room. Someone behind him chuckled. Then someone else. Laughter, muffled and ugly, rolled through the chairs like a slow wave of mockery. Not loud, but loud enough. James didn't turn to look. He didn't respond. He gathered his papers in silence, tucked them back into the folder with careful hands, and nodded once before walking to the door. Outside, the air was cold and sharp. The sky hung low with the threat of rain, and the sidewalk beneath his boots felt harder than usual. The walk home was quiet, but not peaceful. Because something had broken that night, not his pride. He'd kept that locked behind clenched teeth and weathered dignity. It was his patience. And when patience breaks in a man who's used to being quiet, something louder takes its place. James Mitchell had never been a man who sought confrontation. Years of clocking in at dawn, keeping his head down, and doing honest work had carved a quiet, disciplined resolve into him. But the thing about men like James was this. When they finally stand up, they don't yell. They build. The county clerk's office smelled of dust and bureaucracy. The woman behind the counter, sharp glasses, sharper memory, eyed the request form he slid across the desk. "HOA financials?" she asked, tilting her head. "Public access," James replied. Calm, steady. But his eyes told her he wasn't leaving empty-handed. 2 days later, a flash drive arrived in a plain envelope. No note, no stamp of urgency. But what it contained felt like dynamite in James's calloused hands. He sat at his kitchen table, elbow deep in receipts and scanned statements, his laptop's glow reflecting off the lens of his reading glasses, and started digging. Line by line, page by page. By midnight, the pattern had emerged like a bruise beneath pale skin. Fines levied against residents, not routed to community repairs or maintenance. No new roofs, no plumbing upgrades. Instead, line items labeled administrative services and board discretionary expenses stood bloated and vague. Over $8,000 in board hospitality in a single quarter. $2,500 spent on event space consulting when all meetings were held in the same multi-purpose room James had stood in last week. And then there it was, clear as day. $12,000 paid to a landscaping review firm called Evergreen Insight. No physical work recorded. No follow-up maintenance. Just one invoice. The company's owner? Marcus Cartwright, Linda's cousin. James leaned back in his chair. The room was dead silent. Outside, the night wind scraped dead leaves across the sidewalk. He didn't speak. Didn't curse. He simply clicked open a new spreadsheet and began building his own report. He color-coded each questionable expense, labeled every tied connection, highlighted every misuse with the precision of a surgeon. Because rage wasn't useful. Not yet. What was useful? Truth. Truth with proof. Truth with paper trails. Truth that couldn't be mocked or laughed out of a boardroom. James didn't get loud. He got methodical. And if Linda Cartwright thought she could hide behind fine print and family ties, she was about to learn exactly what happens when the wrong man gets pushed too far. The petition began with nothing but a clipboard and a stub of a pencil James found in his junk drawer. By the time the ink dried on the last signature, the stack of papers was thicker than the HOA's bylaws, and twice as honest. James knocked on every door in Maple Ridge Villas, rain or shine, after long shifts at the warehouse, between blisters and back spasms. Most folks opened their doors with caution. Some looked past him before they looked at him, expecting another notice, another neighbor complaint. But the moment he said, "I'm not selling anything. I'm trying to change something," the tension began to ease. There was Marlene from 9A, who whispered like a prisoner that she'd been fined $50 for her American flag brushing against the hedge when the wind kicked up. She'd paid it. She hadn't dared argue. "They said it was visual disorder," she muttered, voice cracking. There was Derek, Unit 6C, whose Labrador was cited 3 times for noise violations, even though the dog belonged to a renter 2 blocks over. When Derek protested, the board threatened to suspend his pool access. And Sandra, a retired teacher from 3D who had stopped attending meetings after being publicly reprimanded for her excessive garden gnome display. 3 gnomes. That was it. "They called it clutter," she said, voice flat. "I call it character." James listened to all of them, not just to gather stories, but to let people feel heard. It had been so long since anyone had. He jotted every detail into a weather-warped notebook. Dates, citation codes, dollar amounts, board member names. It wasn't gossip. It was evidence. A map of frustration that stretched across the neighborhood like cracks in a foundation. He didn't promise miracles. He didn't preach. He just offered one clear thing: a vote of no confidence, a legal process, a way out. In 3 weeks, he had 92 signatures, enough to trigger a vote, enough to make noise. His legs ached. His old boots had started splitting at the seams, the same pair he'd walked to work in for 3 years. But James didn't feel tired, because every name on those pages wasn't just a signature. It was a spark. And together, they were becoming something bigger than any fine, bigger than any board ruling. They were becoming a fire. And James? He wasn't walking anymore. He was marching. The community center smelled like folding chairs and old coffee, but the air was electric with something sharper: expectation. The room, usually half empty for HOA meetings, was packed to the walls. People stood in the back, some spilling into the hallway, murmuring like a storm held back by drywall and restraint. At the front of the room, beneath the flickering fluorescent lights, sat the board. 7 members, stiff behind a long folding table draped in the HOA's navy blue banner. In the middle, Linda Cartwright sat like a queen whose crown was beginning to wobble. Her lips were painted red and pursed tighter than her posture, fingers tapping a pen in a rhythm that screamed discomfort. Then James Mitchell stepped up to the podium. He didn't clear his throat, didn't shuffle his notes. He just began. "I'm not here to yell," he said, voice steady but resonant. "I'm here to show you something." Behind him, the projector hummed to life. Slide after slide flashed across the wall, time-stamped security footage showing him walking past the front gate at 6:42 a.m. every weekday. Digital copies of his bus pass usage, with Metro card pings logged on both ends of his route. A statement from his employer confirming he hadn't driven in over 3 years. A still image of the red Mustang parked in front of Unit 14B, cropped from the same angle as the citation photo. And then came the audio. He played a clip from a previous board meeting, Linda's voice unmistakable, dismissing another resident's concern with a bored, "Maybe they should just follow the rules if they want to live here." The room fell silent. James turned from the screen to face the crowd. "That's the problem," he said. "They think the rules don't have to follow the truth." He held up the original fine. "They fined me for loud music in a red Mustang. I walk 5 miles a day. Rain, ice, July heat. I haven't owned a car in 3 years. They find a ghost. And if they'll do it to me, they'll do it to any one of you." A beat of silence, then murmurs. Then it started. A single clap, then another. It rippled like lightning through dry grass. People stood. People cheered. The crowd wasn't just stirred. It was ignited. Linda didn't speak. Her jaw clenched. Her knuckles whitened around her gavel. But her authority, once absolute, now looked brittle, fractured under the weight of one man's truth laid bare. And James? He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply stepped down, left the podium, and returned to his seat, because the room was speaking for him now. The sky hung gray over the community rec hall that morning, a low, quiet kind of overcast that seemed to hold its breath with the rest of the neighborhood. Folding chairs had been set up in tight rows, clipboards stacked neatly on long folding tables, and a handmade sign near the door read, "Special Vote, Board Recall." The room filled slowly but steadily. Seniors with canes, young parents with strollers, night shift workers still in scrubs or steel-toe boots. They weren't there for refreshments or small talk. They were there to be heard. James arrived as he always did, on foot. Slacks a little worn at the hems, work shirt pressed, expression calm but unreadable. He nodded to a few neighbors who nodded back, some shyly, others with the quiet reverence reserved for people who've shown courage in ways that don't fit headlines. Inside, the mood was tense but focused. Ballots were handed out, boxes guarded, sign-in sheets checked twice. A retired notary served as moderator, flanked by 2 volunteers who'd never imagined themselves arbiters of neighborhood justice. But this wasn't about streetlights or parking spaces anymore. It was about principle. When the count was done, the result was announced without fanfare, 108 to 12. Motion passed, board dissolved. New elections to be held within 30 days. The room didn't erupt, it exhaled. Some people clapped, others just smiled. A few cried, quietly, like something long felt had finally been lifted. James stood near the back, hands in his coat pockets, watching. Not soaking in praise, just making sure it was real. Linda Cartwright didn't go quietly. In the days that followed, she made calls, sent emails, claimed the vote was manipulated, that James was unstable, that he had a vendetta, that he wasn't right since his wife passed. She spun the story into a web of gossip and bitterness. But James didn't bite. He didn't issue a statement, didn't counter the accusations. He just kept walking, 5 miles to work, 5 miles home, sometimes with a thermos in hand, sometimes through the rain, but always forward, because he'd never needed a spotlight, just a path, and a reason to stay on it. And now, the path was open, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been fined unfairly, silenced at a meeting, or made to feel small for daring to ask why. James didn't celebrate. He laced his boots, tucked his head into the wind, and walked on. Because change doesn't always come with banners or parades. Sometimes it walks in quietly and simply doesn't stop. James Mitchell didn't want the seat. He could have had it 3-4 times over. After the vote, neighbors urged him to run, to take Linda's old chair and make it right from the inside. But James shook his head each time, polite but firm. "I didn't fight for a title," he told them. "I fought to make the title mean something." Still, he didn't walk away. Instead, James showed up to every bylaw drafting session with a legal pad and a thermos of black coffee. He sat quietly through the back and forth of language and legality, listening more than he spoke. But when he did speak, the room got quiet, because James didn't use many words, but he never wasted one. He advocated for plain language. No more fine print no one could understand. He proposed a review committee made of rotating residents, not just elected board members, and most importantly, he pushed for the clause that would come to be known as Mitchell's Law. No citation, he said, without a confirmed ID attached, not a vehicle color, not a hearsay complaint, a name, a face, or it doesn't go on record. There was resistance at first. Old habits are hard to rewrite, but one by one they came around. Because every person in that room had either been fined unfairly or known someone who had. They remembered the flag that brushed a hedge, the barking dog that didn't exist, the music played by someone else. James didn't raise his voice or shame anyone. He just reminded them what it felt like to be powerless. When the final draft passed, the room applauded, not loudly but sincerely, a soft thud of relief and resolve. The next day, a knock came at James's door. It was Mrs. Hendricks from Unit 7C, early 80s, arthritis in both knees, never missed a Tuesday bingo. She held out a Tupperware of oatmeal cookies, still warm. "For the man who taught us how to stand up without yelling?" she said. James chuckled, scratched his beard, and thanked her. Then he stood on his porch a little longer than usual, watching the neighborhood shift, not in dramatic ways, but in subtle ones. The maintenance man tipped his cap. A teenager on a skateboard slowed, nodded. The air felt different, not fixed, but fairer. The rules had changed, and for once they had names behind them, faces, stories, proof. James never wanted credit. He just wanted decency. And now, it was written in ink. The sidewalk hadn't gotten steeper, but James Mitchell's knees insisted otherwise. Every morning, the 5-mile walk tugged a little harder at his joints, the pavement less forgiving than it used to be. His boots, resoled twice, carried him along the familiar route with the same quiet rhythm they had for years. Step after step. No engine, no radio, no excuses. Just movement. But something was different now. People waved. The landscaper trimming hedges by the leasing office raised a gloved hand and called out, "Morning, Mr. Mitchell." A woman at the corner bakery handed him a free coffee on Fridays. Kids who once sped past on bikes slowed down to greet him, their parents watching with quiet nods. They didn't see a man without a car. They saw the man who had walked through bureaucracy, arrogance, and silence, and didn't flinch. James hadn't set out to be a symbol. He hadn't wanted to stand at podiums or rewrite rule books, but the world had drawn a line, and he had simply refused to be erased. And now, years later, that quiet refusal still echoed in every small kindness the community offered him. He passed Unit 14B that morning. The red Mustang was long gone. The boy who used to blare music had moved out after graduation, and the unit sat vacant, its shutters sun-bleached, the front step cracked and moss-lined. The place had the look of something left behind, not missed. James paused for a moment, just enough to notice. No bitterness, no smirk, only a small, knowing smile. Some fights leave scars. Others leave imprints, less visible, but just as permanent. James wasn't wealthy. He still packed the same lunch, still lived in the same 2-bedroom condo, still walked the same cracked sidewalk with the slow ease of someone who knew every tree by shape and shadow. But everything had changed. Not because he shouted, because he endured. Because when they tried to find a ghost, they didn't realize that ghost had a spine made of steel and feet that didn't stop moving. James Mitchell, The man with no car had redefined what it meant to show up. Not with volume, but with quiet, relentless dignity. And sometimes, that's the kind of noise no one forgets.